Unscripted, unrehearsed, welcome to Talking Element. Welcome to episode 4 of Talking Element. Tonight we are discussing Acts Part 2, Week 37, Knowing Who to Listen to. And tonight Aaron and I are joined by Brandon McCool. Hello.
Hey, how you doing?
Good, how are you?
Good.
Thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here. My wife Sarah and I have been going to Element for about 10 years now. We co-lead a GC with the Pruitts, and we're also deacons here at Element as well.
Brandon, let me ask you a question.
Sure.
What's it like being married to somebody on staff?
With her being on staff, I feel like we're a lot more involved with more people than we would be if she wasn't. The most frustrating thing about her being on staff is sometimes her workday might be a total of 3 or 4 working hours, but it's split up in 15-minute phone calls and texting segments throughout the entire day.
You leave your work at work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mostly.
That is one of the things about ministry is you almost never leave at work. I mean,
Sure.
I'll be at home sometimes at 10 o'clock at night, and it'll be like, oh, dang it, I got to da-da-da.
Yeah.
Marion's like, what are you doing? Like, we're going to bed, and I'm like, I just got to go take care of this. Hold on.
And with that, would you mind giving us a brief overview?
So today in Acts, Paul actually starts to go on his trip to Rome. But it starts off where some rough seas, and it's going to end up, ultimately next week you'll see, in a shipwreck. And I think there's a reason that Luke speaks about the rough seas the way that he does, because there's a lot of fear in Paul's day and superstitions about the ocean and what these deep waters could actually hold. And that's why I called the message, who to listen to. Like in the midst of our fears in our lives, who do we actually listen to? Do we focus on our fears? Or do we focus on the things that God has said about himself and trust him in the midst of those fears?
So we'll start with the question again from the middle of the message. What thing in your life do you allow to hold power over you when in reality they don't? Or what superstition do you have?
I'd say for me, for a while, I felt like I had to remember each one of my sins that I committed so I could confess them and ask for forgiveness.
So you used to think that confession was integral to being forgiven.
Mm-hmm.
Did that come did someone teach you that? Did you grow up with that somewhere?
I would say that dated far enough back where I don't remember where that originated from. So I've learned from when I was at that point, but it's exhausting to try to recall all the sins that you've done throughout the day and feel like, well, if I don't confess them, then I'm not forgiven for them. But I've learned through the years that that's just, it's not true. But the reality is what Jesus has done has paid for our sins, past, present, and future, and it's something that only he was capable of doing, and nothing that I could do would undo what he's already done for me.
I think mine's a little bit like that too, because I think a lot of Christians live with almost a karma mentality, even if they don't say that they do. Like always have this thing where it's like, oh, if I sinned and I messed up or I did this thing, well then God's gonna come and get me, or God's gonna make something bad happen in my life because I did this or I didn't do that correctly. Whatever it is, I always have this idea that somehow, if I don't do it right, then this is gonna happen. And that's superstition. That's not true.
So both of you kind of had this either karma or a continual ongoing repentance, otherwise God might smite thee, right?
Well, I still feel like you fall back into that so often. I think a lot of Christians do. We have this idea that God's forgiveness is not as full as it actually is. We don't understand that Jesus died for my sins 2,000 years ago, so all my sins were in the future when he died, so he paid for all my sins, but for some reason it's so hard to trust and grasp that.
I've totally experienced that, to where you have a sin, and even though you confess it and ask for forgiveness and you feel forgiven, you can't help but the next time something goes bad, this little voice in your head kind of links the two together out of the guilt that you feel because of the mistakes that you've made.
Well, I loved you had a line in the message. We need to trust Jesus no matter what our fears say. Yeah. And how do we? So I wanted to ask, how do we do that? I might be able to do that today, but in an hour from now, I might listen more to the fear. So what are the steps? And to kick it off, I felt like where you got to is first you have to have knowledge, then you have to believe of who Jesus is, and it has to be a right picture, right? So on some level, it has to be, you can't just take any information about Jesus. It has to be
the right knowledge.
The right knowledge, right? And then you have to believe that knowledge before trust can be there. And so I wanted to...
Because that's faith. I mean, the word faith literally means trust. And so too often when we hear the word faith, we think it's mustering up belief. It's not. Faith is the word trust. And so it's trusting what God has said about himself. And that results, well, in faith, because it's faith. This is, again, where I think it's good with these discussions that a lot of times it comes back to the idea of community and community centered on the gospel around each other. Because I think when you read through, like 1 Corinthians, and Paul talks about spiritual gifts, I mean, there are obviously people who have like a gift of faith, of trust that's much stronger than mine. And some people have a gift of knowledge or teaching that's much stronger than mine. Or, whatever. And when we're around those people in community, we strengthen one another to do that. Where we can't be afraid to speak about what fear we see someone running after in their life. And so I think we can point out that fear, not in a judgmental way, but how can I help you to work through that? Because sometimes what it takes is someone next to us saying, hey, I notice it seems like you're really fearful of this thing. You shouldn't be, and I know it's trite to say you shouldn't be, so how can I help you to begin to walk through that fear? Or what do your fears say? What are your fears saying to you right now?
Well, I think that's a very good point, because first you have to know what your fears say.
Exactly.
And then you have to know what the truth about Jesus is before you can even begin to really decide how do you not listen to your fear and listen to something else.
Because again, fear is something, there's no fear in love. And when we fear too much, it moves us from the realm of loving one another to of withdrawal from one another. And withdrawal and being with one another, that doesn't mean you have to be within 6 feet of somebody and talk. It could be just even on the phone or something, but sometimes that fear causes us to cease to love one another.
When you're withdrawing a little bit, but it turns into isolating yourselves or disconnecting from those that you're usually in community with, whether it's friends or family or church or whatever, then I think that's where it becomes a little more dangerous when you let it get to that point.
Yeah, when you let fear overtake what God is calling you to. Yeah.
So speaking of COVID, so I think a lot of people right now who maybe are looking at Christians or how Christians respond, and they hear where you talk about how the water's underneath Jesus, right? Where Jesus has ultimate authority. He's already defeated, or he created and then has ultimate authority over. How do we respond to people who say, well, why doesn't he stop COVID-19, or why did he allow it to be here?
I think that it is an improper view of God and our fallen world and how God acts in the world to say, well, why doesn't he just stop it? Because what that does is it puts God in the realm of our whims, and that God can only be God if he does what I want him to do. We never see the bigger picture. We never see the things of what God is doing and bringing about glory to himself and good to his people through all the hardships that take place. And we have to understand that the responsibility for sin in the world is our own fault. We do that. But God is the one who brings redemption out of our sin.
It also goes back to last week at our notes night, we were talking about the detours and things that we just didn't see coming in our lives, that just not the way I would have had it, but some people in my gospel community shared some really, really cool stories of some detours that they've experienced. And they were hard, and they weren't fun, and they weren't easy. But it's so cool that the way that they can talk about it now is all the things that are happening in their life now that they would have never experienced had they not had that detour.
Whether this is someone eating a bat or it was made in a lab in the middle of China, still in the end, God will do beautiful things. And I think one of the beautiful things he's doing right now is he is changing how the church thinks about church, how the church thinks about community, how we are now doing things to connect and take messages, deeper than they were before to help people to understand things. We would have never done that before. We would have just kept going the way we're going. But God is using these things, I think, to move his church to engage differently in the world, and that's a very good thing.
I think when we're in the midst of the storm, whether it be Paul on a ship or COVID or job loss or whatever, we're going through at the time, just to trust that God has an overall plan that's better for us. And like you've mentioned in several of your messages of, God, what do you want me to learn through this struggle I'm dealing with right now? And how can I come out better after going through it, because you're carrying me through it and teaching me along the way?
If people want to get a truer picture of Jesus, going back to that knowledge, which I think is kind of at the beginning of that step to faith, what would you recommend that they do, or how could someone gain a more proper image and viewpoint and knowledge of God?
A good place to start is read the scriptures. There's so many voices out there telling everyone, well, Jesus thought this or Jesus did that. So if you read the scriptures and where Jesus walks on the water, and you got to ask, why did they freak out? Why did they say it's a ghost? Weren't they Jewish people? Did they believe in ghosts? And you start asking these questions. Why did Jesus say, take heart, it is I? Why did Jesus actually even invite Peter onto the water? Why did the storm calm when he got into the boat? You look at what Jesus did and ask the questions that surround that, so you can get a better picture of who he is. I think that is a good way to kind of get through all the voices that are there, to get a better picture of who he is. And that will teach us to trust him. Because there are a couple things in the scriptures, it's like, why did Jesus say that? But
just a couple.
And just a couple.
Okay.
But when you go back and look historically around the things and why you're like, I always said it because of this, and then all of a sudden it just makes so much more sense. I think when we have a true picture of who he is, it will change us if we trust it and listen to him.
I had a conversation with Chris Reese this week, and we were talking about myriad of things, and he was telling me the story of when he worked for the court system, and there was this lady there who he was in tech, and so she'd come to him after, like, almost every time going to court, that her computer wouldn't work, her laptop wouldn't work properly in court, and he'd show her what she was doing wrong or how to fix it, and on the fly, and the umpteenth time he basically says, look, we can keep doing this, but you're constantly frustrated. Because you haven't made it important enough for you to actually hear what I'm saying and to learn what you need to do there. So her problem started to go away as soon as she really did. She started focusing on it. And I think it's the same for this. Like I love the questions you said. Why did Peter start freaking out when he was in the water? Why did Jesus say this when he said it? But it takes making it important in my life for me to want to read, to want to open my phone or my, the web browser and Google, what is it, that I can learn from trusted sources.
It is, it's like you said, it's sometimes, like, so Peter gets out of the boat, right? And he's focusing on Jesus and he's walking. Then all of a sudden, everything is so loud around him, all the voices, and he just starts. And then he starts to sink because he starts listening to everything else rather than listening to Jesus. And I think that's a tough thing in our culture right now, is there's so many voices and they are all so loud, and it would do us a lot of good to quiet many of those things.
And to actually listen, not just ask and then carry on with your life. Sometimes,
God, what do you want me to learn? And you just keep walking. It's like, okay, be still and know I'm God.
Sometimes you just need to have a little bit of silence. I have learned that.
We must trust God as we go through the midst of our wind and our waves, if that trial is to have any meaning at all.
Last week just gave me something that was a clear-cut symbol of him asking me to do something, and it was just like, okay.
You say you're going to Rome?
No, not going to Rome. COVID.
Well, that is our prayer too, that we all figure out what it is God has for us during the shipwreck that is 2020, and that we grow stronger through it, and on the other side. Well, thank you both. Appreciate it. And that is it for episode 4. We'll see you next week.
And we're out. 2, 3, 4. You need like a theme song. like one that's like. I know you got one, but I'm just saying.
Was that the Seinfeld song?
I was
just
trying to
did?
think what that was.
No,
sounded like.
that's.